I never imagined my life would turn out this way. A few years ago, I had what I thought was a stable family, a husband, a teenage son, and a life that, while modest, was filled with love. Or at least I thought it was. Then Greg, my ex-husband, dropped the bombshell. He was leaving me for someone else. The divorce was messy, as these things often are, but I managed to scrape together enough to keep going. My priority was our son, Jacob, who had just turned 15. At the time, I told myself he'd be my anchor through the storm. Instead, he became another wave, crashing into what was left of my world. Greg didn't just remarry, he upgraded. Diane wasn't just beautiful, she was rich in a way that made people notice. She lived in a house that could have been in a Hollywood movie, drove cars that cost more than my yearly salary, and threw parties with catered sushi and champagne fountains. At first, I thought it was just the usual post-divorce bitterness clouding my judgment. But Jacob? He was mesmerized. It started with little things. Mom, why don't we have a pool? Or, Diane took me shopping. She says I should have name-brand clothes. It was easy to brush off at first, thinking it was just the excitement of something new. But the more time he spent with Greg and Diane, the more he seemed to drift away from me. When he started comparing every aspect of my life to hers, I realized this wasn't just about teenage rebellion. Diane's house doesn't smell weird like ours, he once said, wrinkling his nose at the scent of dinner simmering on the stove. I bit back my frustration and reminded him that I was doing the best I could. But the comments kept coming, chipping away at my self-esteem. My small apartment, the second-hand furniture, my late nights working at the diner, all of it was beneath him now. The final blow came one Saturday morning. Jacob sat across from me at the kitchen table, his face calm and determined in a way that seemed far too grown-up for a 15-year-old. Mom, I think I want to live with Dad and Diane full-time, he said, avoiding eye contact. My heart sank. Why? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. They have more opportunities for me there, he said matter-of-factly. Diane says she can help me with college, and she's been introducing me to people who can give me internships. Plus, he hesitated, then blurted out, they just have more to offer. It felt like a punch to the gut, but I tried to stay calm. Jacob, I know things are different here, but this is your home. I'm your mom. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Defiance? I've been thinking, he said slowly, maybe Diane could adopt me. She's already doing so much for me, and it would make sense, right? I was too stunned to respond. My own son wanted to replace me. My hands shook as I pushed my chair back and left the room, unable to face him. The tears came as soon as I closed the door to my bedroom. Over the next few months, I tried to fight for him. I called Greg, begged him to reconsider, even spoke to a lawyer about my rights. But Jacob was adamant, and Greg was all too happy to encourage it. Diane, of course, played the role of the benevolent stepmother, promising she just wanted what was best for Jacob. Eventually, I gave in. The court agreed to let Jacob live with Greg and Diane, and I was left with a hollow victory. I'd spared myself the pain of dragging him through a custody battle he didn't want. For 2 years, I watched from the sidelines as Jacob's life became something I didn't recognize. He stopped answering my calls, skipped holidays with me, and only sent the occasional text, usually when he needed something. Social media became my window into his new world. Luxury vacations, private schools, expensive gifts. There he was, smiling in front of Diane's yacht, posing with his new car, laughing at parties that looked like they belonged in magazines. Each picture felt like a dagger. I tried to move on. I worked long hours, saved what little I could, and focused on rebuilding my life. Eventually, I met someone new, Martin. He was kind, successful, and steady in a way Greg never was. When he proposed, I said yes, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. Martin treated me like a queen, and while his wealth wasn't Diane level, he was comfortable. He bought a beautiful house for us to share, encouraged me to quit my grueling job at the diner, and even helped me start my own small business. For a while, I was happy. And then Jacob came back. It started with a phone call when I almost didn't answer because the number wasn't saved in my phone. When I picked up, I heard his voice for the first time in months. Mom, he said, sounding hesitant. Can we talk? I didn't know how to feel. Anger? Relief? What's going on, Jacob? I asked cautiously. There was a long pause, then a sigh. Things aren't working out with Diane and Dad, he admitted. Can I come stay with you? I was too stunned to reply. After all this time, after everything he'd said and done, he was asking to come back into my life. And as much as I wanted to slam the door in his face, a part of me, a big part, still missed my son. Let's talk in person, I finally said. When he showed up at my doorstep a few hours later, he wasn't the same confident, polished teenager I'd last seen. He looked tired, his clothes rumpled, and his shoulders slouched. What happened? I asked after letting him inside. Jacob sighed and sank into the couch. Diane kicked me out, he said bluntly. The words hit me like a brick. Why? She and Dad split up, he explained, his voice bitter. She said I wasn't her responsibility anymore. She didn't even let me grab all my stuff before she had the locks changed. I felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by years of resentment. So you came back because you had nowhere else to go? Jacob's face turned red. That's not fair, he muttered. I just thought. He trailed off, then added, I heard about Martin. I figured things were better for you now. There it was. The real reason. My son wasn't coming back because he missed me. He was coming back because I had something to offer now. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. Jacob, you can stay here, I said slowly, but we need to have a serious conversation about what happened. He nodded, looking more like the boy I used to know. Okay, Mom, he said quietly. I just want to start over. I wasn't sure if that was possible, but for now it was enough. Having Jacob back in my home felt surreal, like stepping into a dream that could easily slip into a nightmare. The boy sitting across from me wasn't the same person who had left 2 years ago with a smug grin and a bag full of designer clothes. This Jacob looked worn, like the shine of his new life had dulled, leaving cracks I wasn't sure I wanted to fix. I set a cup of tea in front of him and sat down, studying him closely. I need to understand, Jacob, I said gently, though my heart felt heavy. Why now? Why, after everything? He didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he stared into the tea as if the answers might surface there. Diane, she's not who I thought she was, he began hesitantly. When Dad and Diane got divorced, things got messy fast. She didn't want me around anymore. Said I wasn't her real family and told me to figure it out with Dad. And what did your dad say? I asked, already suspecting the answer. Jacob winced. He said he couldn't deal with it. He's living in some tiny condo now and doesn't have space for me. He told me I needed to grow up and handle things on my own. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my emotions in check. I wanted to yell, to remind him that he'd chosen them, that he'd told me I wasn't enough. But I swallowed the words. The hurt in his voice was real, and for all my bitterness, I didn't want to see my son broken. So you came here, I said evenly. Because you heard about Martin. Jacob's face flushed, and he looked up sharply. That's not the only reason, he insisted, though the way his eyes darted away betrayed him. I didn't know where else to go. I knew you'd take me in, even if he hesitated. Even if I don't deserve it. Those words hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the boy I used to know. The one who used to hold my hand while crossing the street, who hugged me tight when he was scared. I wanted to believe that boy was still in there somewhere, but the years of rejection weren't so easily forgotten. Jacob, I said carefully, I need you to be honest with me. Are you here because you want to rebuild our relationship, or are you here because you think I can offer you a better life now? His shoulders slumped. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe both. I messed up, Mom. I thought Diane was better. I thought their world was what I wanted, but it wasn't real. She didn't really care about me. And Dad. I don't even know who he is anymore. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my chest easing just a little. It wasn't the apology I'd hoped for, but it was something. A crack in the wall he'd built between us. You can stay here, I said, my voice firm. But there are going to be rules. You're almost 18, Jacob. You're not a little kid anymore. If you're living under my roof, you're going to act like part of this family. That means contributing, being honest, and showing respect." He nodded quickly, like he'd expected nothing less. "I get it, Mom. I'll do whatever it takes." The days that followed were awkward. Jacob was quiet, almost withdrawn, and I found myself walking on eggshells, unsure how to act around him. Martin, bless his heart, was nothing but supportive. He didn't ask too many questions or press Jacob about his sudden return. Instead, he gave us space to figure things out. But the cracks in Jacob's armor began to show quickly. One afternoon, I came home to find him sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone with a scowl. "What's wrong?" I asked, setting my bag down. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just everyone from school is posting about their vacations. Diane used to take me on trips like that." It was a small comment, but it felt like a knife in my side. "Jacob," I said carefully, "you can't keep comparing your life to what it was with Diane. That's over now. You're here, and we're going to move forward, but you have to let that go." He didn't reply, but the look on his face told me he wasn't ready to hear it. Over the next few weeks, I started to see glimpses of the son I'd lost. He helped me cook dinner, asked about my day, and even started bonding with Martin, who treated him with a patience I envied. But there were also moments that reminded me of the gap between us. He was quick to get defensive, especially when money came up. One evening, while we were eating dinner, he blurted out, "So, how rich is Martin, exactly?" I nearly choked on my food. "Excuse me?" Jacob shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "I mean, he bought this house, right? And you don't work anymore. He must be doing pretty well." Martin raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, letting me handle it. I set my fork down and looked Jacob in the eye. "That's not your concern," I said firmly. "Martin and I are building a life together, and it's not something you need to worry about." Jacob looked away, muttering, "I was just asking," but I knew better. He was still measuring, still trying to see how this new life stacked up against the one he'd lost. The breaking point came when I overheard him on the phone one night. I was walking past his room when I caught snippets of his conversation. "Yeah, I'm back with my mom. No, it's not as bad as I thought. Her new husband's loaded, though. Might not be so bad staying here for a while." My stomach dropped. I stood frozen outside his door, feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak. Was I just a convenience to him? A safety net until he could figure out his next move? The next morning, I confronted him. "Jacob," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to talk about what I heard last night." He looked confused, then guilty as realization dawned. "Mom, it's not what you think." "Stop," I interrupted. "You need to decide why you're here. If you're just looking for a place to crash until something better comes along, tell me now." "I can't keep doing this, Jacob. I can't let you use me." His face crumpled, and for the first time in years, I saw real emotion, raw and unfiltered. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears pooling in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't mean it like that. I don't know how to fix things. I don't know how to be your son again." The anger drained from me, replaced by an aching sadness. "We'll figure it out," I said softly. "But it has to start with honesty, Jacob. No more games." He nodded, wiping his face. "Okay, I'll try." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. Life with Jacob back in my house was like learning to walk again after a bad fall. Every step felt unsteady, every interaction laced with the fear of stumbling into the past. He'd apologized, yes, and he seemed to mean it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dancing around an invisible wall neither of us knew how to tear down. Still, I tried. I made a conscious effort to include him in my daily routines, hoping to rebuild the trust we'd both let slip away. We cooked together, went grocery shopping, and even binge-watched a few shows, though the moments felt fragile, like they could shatter if I said or did the wrong thing. Martin, ever the patient observer, gave us space but occasionally chimed in with a kind word or joke to ease the tension. For a while, it seemed like we were making progress. Jacob started opening up about small things, how he missed playing basketball, how his grades had slipped after Diane and Greg's divorce, how lonely he'd felt even in their sprawling mansion. I listened, nodding, biting back the urge to say, "I told you so." But there were moments, too, that reminded me of the distance we still had to cover. One evening, as I was folding laundry, I overheard Jacob on a call in his room. His voice was low but sharp, tinged with frustration. "Yeah, I know it's not the same," he hissed. "But what am I supposed to do?
She's all I've got right now."
I paused mid-fold, my heart sinking. Was that how he saw me? Not his mom, not someone who loved him unconditionally, but a placeholder for the life he'd lost? The doubt gnawed at me, even as I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it. The real test came a few weeks later, when Jacob brought up the idea of reconnecting with some of his old friends. "They've got a party this weekend," he said casually over dinner. I was thinking I might go. "Is that okay?" I hesitated, exchanging a glance with Martin. On the surface, it sounded innocent enough, just a teenager wanting to hang out with his peers. But something about his tone, the way he avoided my eyes, set off alarm bells. "Which friends?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Jacob shrugged, stabbing at his plate. "Just some guys from school. You don't know them." "And this party," Martin chimed in, his voice calm but firm. "Is it supervised?" Jacob rolled his eyes. "I'm not a kid, you know. I can handle myself." "That's not the point," I said, my patience fraying. "You're still rebuilding trust here, Jacob. If you want to go, I need to know where you'll be and who you'll be with." He threw down his fork, the clatter echoing in the suddenly tense room. "Why does it matter? I'm trying, okay? Isn't that enough?" "No," I said firmly, leaning forward. "It's not enough. Trust takes time, Jacob, and you don't get to skip the hard parts just because you're uncomfortable." For a moment, I thought he might storm out. His jaw clenched, his fists balled at his sides, but then he deflated, sinking back into his chair.
"Fine," he muttered.
"I'll stay home." The air was heavy for the rest of the meal, and I went to bed that night feeling like I'd failed him again. But when I woke up the next morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter in Jacob's messy handwriting. "Mom, I get why you're mad. I know I've got a lot to prove, and I'm trying, even if it doesn't seem like it. Thanks for giving me a chance. I won't mess it up again." I stared at the note, my chest tightening with a mix of relief and sadness. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, a step forward, however small. As the weeks passed, Jacob's attitude began to shift. He started taking more responsibility around the house, volunteering to do the dishes or run errands without being asked. He even got a part-time job at a local coffee shop, something he'd never done before. It was almost as if he was trying to prove, not just to me, but to himself, that he could stand on his own 2 feet. But just as I started to believe we'd turned a corner, the past came knocking in the form of a voicemail from Greg. I listened to it twice, trying to make sense of his slurred words. "Listen, I know Jacob's with you now, but we need to talk. Diane's been saying some things and, well, just call me back, okay?" I hadn't spoken to Greg in months, and the thought of opening that door again made my stomach churn. But I couldn't ignore it. If it concerned Jacob, I needed to know. When I finally called him back, Greg was surprisingly coherent, though his tone was heavy with regret. "I messed up," he admitted. "I let Diane handle everything, and now Jacob hates me." I didn't argue. "What does this have to do with Diane?" Greg hesitated, then sighed. "She's been telling people that Jacob was using her, that he only stuck around for the money. She's saying she never wanted him to live with us in the first place." The anger that bubbled up was almost too much to contain. "Are you serious? She's the one who encouraged him to cut ties with me. She gave him everything he asked for, and now she's throwing him under the bus." "I know," Greg said miserably. "I'm trying to fix it, but Jacob won't even talk to me. Can you blame him?" I snapped. "You both abandoned him the second things got hard. You don't just get to waltz back in and play the victim." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought he'd hung up. Then he said, "I know I don't deserve his forgiveness, but I need him to know I'm sorry. Can you tell him that?" I hung up without answering, my hands shaking. The audacity of it all was almost laughable. But when I turned around and saw Jacob standing in the doorway, his face pale and drawn, the laughter died in my throat. "How much did you hear?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Enough," he said, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Is it true?"
Did Diane really say that about me?
I hesitated, then nodded.
Yes.
"But that doesn't define you, Jacob. You're more than what she thinks of you." He looked down, his shoulders trembling. "I gave up everything for her, Mom. I chose her over you, and now she's saying I was just a leech? Do you know how that feels?" I stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "I do," I said softly. "I know exactly how that feels. But you don't have to let it define you. You have a chance to start over, Jacob. To prove them wrong. Not for their sake, but for yours." For the first time in what felt like forever, he hugged me. It was awkward, hesitant, but it was real. And in that moment, I felt something shift between us, like the cracks were finally starting to heal. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, I believed we could walk it together. After that night, something fundamental changed between Jacob and me. It wasn't like the movies where a heartfelt conversation magically heals years of pain, but it was a start. The walls between us weren't gone, but they'd thinned enough that we could see each other clearly for the first time in years. Still, I was wary. Trust wasn't something I could freely give anymore, not after everything we'd been through. Jacob was trying. I could see it in the way he threw himself into his job, the way he volunteered to help around the house, and the way he made an effort to connect with Martin. But part of me couldn't help but wonder, was it real, or was he still calculating, weighing his options and waiting for a better opportunity to come along? That question lingered in the back of my mind until a moment of unexpected clarity forced it into the open. It started with an innocuous phone call from my lawyer, a routine check-in about some paperwork for Martin and me. I was in the kitchen, juggling dinner prep and the conversation, when I saw Jacob out of the corner of my eye, lingering just out of earshot. "Everything's in order," the lawyer said, "but there was an inquiry flagged on your financials recently. It looks like someone tried to access your accounts through an old family connection. Do you have any idea who that might be?" My blood ran cold. "No," I said carefully, glancing at Jacob. "I'll need to look into that. Thanks for letting me know." After hanging up, I turned to Jacob, my heart pounding. "Is there something you need to tell me?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He froze, his hand halfway to the fridge. "What do you mean?" "An inquiry was flagged on my financial accounts," I said slowly. "Do you know anything about that?" His face paled, and for a second, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who couldn't lie to me no matter how hard he tried. Mom, I swear I wasn't trying to do anything shady. I wanted to know how much Martin was worth. That's all." Anger flared in me like a match dropped in gasoline. "Jacob," I said sharply, "do you have any idea how serious that is? You could have compromised everything we've worked for." "I wasn't going to take anything," he protested, his voice cracking. I was curious. I wanted to understand why you trust him so much when you couldn't trust me." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, my anger mingling with a deep, aching sadness. "This isn't about Martin," I said, my voice trembling. "This is about you, Jacob. You've been so focused on what you think you're owed that you haven't stopped to think about what you've done. You don't earn trust by snooping through bank accounts. You earn it by showing up, by being honest, by doing the work." He looked at me, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm trying, Mom.
I really am.
But it's hard. I don't know how to fix this." I sighed, the fight draining out of me. "I know it's hard," I said softly. "But you have to decide what kind of person you want to be. If you keep chasing shortcuts, you'll end up right back where you started, alone and lost." He nodded, wiping his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I won't do it again." I wanted to believe him. For all my doubts, I wanted to believe that this time he meant it. The weeks that followed were a blur of cautious optimism. Jacob stayed out of trouble, focused on his job, and even started saving up for a car. He seemed genuinely invested in rebuilding his life, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope. But hope is a fragile thing. easily shattered by the weight of reality. One afternoon, I received a call from the manager at Jacob's coffee shop. "I thought you should know," she said carefully, "that Jacob's been having some trouble with one of the other employees. There was an incident today, nothing serious, but it's worth keeping an eye on." I thanked her and hung up, my stomach churning. When Jacob came home that evening, I confronted him. "What happened at work?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. He hesitated, then sighed. "It was nothing. Just a stupid argument with one of the other guys." He was being a jerk, and I stood up for myself. "Jacob," I said firmly, "this is important. If you want to move forward, you can't afford to let your temper get the better of you. Do you understand that?" He nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, I get it. I'll do better." But the incident lingered in my mind, a reminder of how easily old habits could resurface. The real turning point came a few weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning. Martin and I were sitting on the patio, enjoying coffee and the crisp autumn air, when Jacob appeared, looking unusually nervous. "Can I talk to you guys?" he asked, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Of course," Martin said, gesturing for him to sit. Jacob took a deep breath, his gaze flickering between us. "I've been thinking a lot," he began hesitantly. "About everything. About the choices I've made, the people I've hurt, and I want to make things right. Not just with you, but with Dad, too." I stared at him, stunned. "You want to talk to your dad?" He nodded. "I know he screwed up, but so did I. And I think if I want to move forward, I have to start by forgiving him. Otherwise, I'll just keep carrying this weight around." Tears welled in my eyes, and I reached for his hand. "That's incredibly brave, Jacob," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But are you sure you're ready for that?" He nodded again, more firmly this time.
Yeah.
"I am." The conversation with Greg wasn't easy. There were tears, accusations, and long silences where neither of them knew what to say. But by the end of it, something miraculous happened. They hugged. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the past, but it was a start. For the first time in years, I felt like Jacob was truly free, free from the resentment, the bitterness, and the fear that had held him back. And as I watched him walk away with Greg that afternoon, his shoulders straight and his head held high, I knew we'd finally turned a corner. Life would never be perfect, but it didn't have to be. What mattered was that we'd found our way back to each other, one step at a time. And for the first time in years, I felt whole again.